Chapter 1. Listen. The Sanctuary of the Redeemers on Shotover Scarp is named after a damn lie. For there is no redemption that goes on there unless sanctuary. The country around it is full of scrub and spindly weeds, and you can barely tell the difference between summer and winter. Which is to say that it's always bloody freezing no matter what time of year. The sanctuary itself is visible for miles when there is no filthy smog obscuring it, which is rare, and is made of flint, concrete, and rice flour. The flour makes the concrete harder than rock, and this is one of the reasons that the prison, for what it truly is, has resisted the many attempts to take it by siege, attempts now considered so futile that no one has tried to take Shotover Sanctuary for hundreds of years. It is a stinking, foul place, and no one except the Lord Redeemers go there willingly. Who are their prisoners, then? This is the wrong word for those who are taken to Shotover, because prisoner suggests a crime, and they, none of them, have offended any law made by man or God, nor do they look like any prisoner you will ever have seen. Those who are brought here are all boys under the age of 10. Depending on their age when they enter, it may be more than 15 years before they leave, and then only half will do so. The other half will have left in a shroud of blue sacking and been buried in Genki's field, a graveyard which begins under the walls. This graveyard is vast, spanning as far as you can see, so you will have some idea of the size of the Shotover, and how very hard it is to even stay alive there. No one knows their way around all of it, and it's easy to get lost within its endless corridors that twist and turn high and low, as in any wilderness. There is no change in the way it looks. Every part of it looks much the same as every other part, brown, dark, grim, and smelling of something old and rancid. Standing in one of these corridors is a boy looking out of a window holding a large, dark blue sack. He is perhaps 14 or 15 years old. He is not sure, and neither is anyone else. He has forgotten his real name because everyone who comes here is rebaptized with the name of one of the martyrs of the Lord Redeemers. And there are many of them on account of the fact that, time out of mind, everyone they have failed to convert has hated their guts. The boy, staring out of the window, is called Thomas Cale. Although no one ever uses his first name, he is committing a most grievous sin by doing so. What drew him to the window was the sound of the northwest gate groaning as it always did on one of its rare openings, like some giant with appallingly painful knees. Oh my god, it's me. And, this is how my mice view me. A giant with appallingly painful knees. He watched as two lords in their black cassocks stepped over the threshold and ushered in a small boy of about 8, followed by another slightly younger, and then another. Cale counted 20 in all before another brace of redeemers brought up the rear, and slowly and arthritically the gate began to close. Cale's expression changed as he leant forward to see out of the closing gate and into the scablands beyond. He had been outside the walls on only 6 occasions since he had come here more than a decade before. It was said the youngest child ever brought to the sanctuary. On these 6 occasions he was watched as if the lives of his guards depended on it, which they did. Had he failed any of these 6 tests, for that is what they were, he would have been killed on the spot. Of his former life he could remember nothing. As the gate shut, he turned his attention to the boys again. None of them was plump, but they had the round faces of young children. All were wide-eyed at the sight of the keep, its immense size, its huge walls, but though bewildered and scared, simply by the strangeness of the surroundings, they were not afraid. Cale's chest filled with deep and strange emotions that he could not have given a name to, but lost in them as he was, his talent for keeping one ear alive to whatever was going on around him saved him, as it had so many times in the past. He moved away from the window and walked on down the corridor. You, wait. Cale stopped and turned round. One of the redeemers, hugely fat with folds of skin hanging over the edge of his collar, was standing in one of the doorways off the passage, steam and odd sounds emerging from the room behind him. Cale looked at him, his expression unchanged. Come here and let me see you. The boy walked towards him. "Oh, it's you," said the fat Redeemer. "What are you doing here?" "The Lord of Discipline sent me to take this to the drum." He held up the blue sack he was carrying. "What did you say? Speak up." Cale knew, of course, that the fat Redeemer was deaf in one ear, and had deliberately spoken quietly. Cale repeated himself, this time shouting loudly. "Are you trying to be funny, boy?" "No, Redeemer." "What were you doing by the window?" "The window? Don't play me for a fool. What were you doing?" "I heard the northwest gate being opened." "Did you? By God." This seemed to distract him. "They're early," he grunted with annoyance, and then turned and looked back into the kitchen, for that was who the fat man was, the Lord of Victuals, the overseer of the kitchen, from which the Redeemers were well fed, and the boys hardly at all. 20 extra for dinner," he shouted into the evil-smelling steam behind him. He turned back to Cale. "Were you thinking when you were by that window?" "No, Redeemer." "Were you daydreaming?" "No, Redeemer." "If I catch you loitering again, Cale, I'll have the hide off you. Hear me?" "Yes, Redeemer." The Lord of Victuals turned back into the room and began to close the door. As he did so, Cale spoke softly, but quite distinctly, so that anyone not hard of hearing would have picked it up. "Hope you charred on it, you bloody dirtsack." Bloody dirtsack. The door slammed shut, and Cale headed off down the corridor, dragging the large sack behind him. It took nearly 15 minutes, running most of the way, before he came to the drum located at the end of its own short passageway. It was called the drum because that's what it looked like, as long as you disregarded the fact that it was 6 feet tall and embedded in a brick wall. On the other side of the drum was a place sealed off from the rest of the sanctuary, where, it was rumoured, there lived 12 nuns who cooked for the Redeemers only and washed their clothes. Cale did not know what a nun was, and had never seen one, although from time to time he did talk to one of them through the drum. He did not know what made nuns different from other women, who were spoken of rarely, and then only with distaste. There were 2 exceptions: the hanged Redeemer's holy sister, and the blessed Imelda Lambertini, who at the age of 11 had died of ecstasy during her first communion. Don't do drugs, kids. The Redeemers had not explained what ecstasy was, and no one was foolish enough to ask. Cale gave the drum a spin, and then it turned on its axis, revealing a large opening. He dumped the blue sack inside it, and gave it another spin, then he banged on the side, causing it to emit a loud boom. He waited for 30 seconds, and then a muffled bow spoke from the other side of the drum. "Well, what is it?" Cale put his head next to the drum so he could be heard, his lips almost touching the surface. "Redeemer Bosco wants his back by tomorrow morning," he shouted. "Why didn't it come with all the others?" "How the hell would I know?" There was a high-pitched cry of muffled rage from the other side of the drum. "What's your name, you impus pup?" "Dominic Savio," lied Cale. "Well, Dominic Savio, I'll report you to the Lord of Discipline, and he'll have the hide off you. I could care less." 20 minutes later, Cale arrived back at the Lord Militant's Training Bureau. It was empty, except for the Lord himself, who did not look up or give any sign that he had seen Cale. He continued to write in his ledger for another 5 minutes, before speaking, still without looking up. "What took you so long?" "The Lord of Victuals stopped me in the corridor of the Outer Banks." "Why?" "You heard a noise outside, I think." "What noise?" Finally, the Lord Militant looked at Cale. His eyes were a pale, almost watery blue, but sharp. They did not miss much, or anything. "They were opening the northwest gate to let in the fresh boys. He wasn't expecting them today. I'd say his nose was out of joint." "Hold your tongue," said the Lord Militant, but mildly by his unforgiving standards. Cale knew that he despised the Lord of Battles, and hence he felt it less dangerous to speak in such a way of the Redeemer. "I asked your friend about the rumour they'd arrived," said the Redeemer. "I have no friends, Redeemer," replied Cale. "They're forbidden." The Lord Militant laughed softly, not a pleasant sound. "I have no worries about you on that score, Cale. But if we must plod, the scrawny blonde-haired one, what do you call him?" "Henry." "I know his given name. You have a moniker for him. We call him Vague Henry." The Lord Militant laughed, but this time there was an echo of some ordinary good humour. "Very good," he said appreciatively. I asked him what time the fresh boat has arrived, and he said he wasn't sure. Sometime between 8 bells and 9. I then asked him how many there were, and he said 15 or so, but it might have been more. He looked Cale straight in the eyes. I thrashed him to teach him to be more specific in future. What do you think of that? It's all the same to me, Redeemer, replied Cale flatly. He deserved whatever punishment you gave him. Really? They're very gratifying you should think so. What time did they arrive? Just before 5. How many were there? 20. What ages? None younger than 7, none older than 9. Of what kind? Oh, this one's going to be difficult. 4 mazes, 4 Eastlanders, 3 folders, 5 half-castes, 3 Miamis, and 1 I didn't know. The Lord Militant grunted, as if only barely satisfied that all his questions had been answered so precisely. Go over to the board. I've set a puzzle for you. 10 minutes. Cale walked over to a large table, 20 feet by 20, on which the Lord Militant had rolled out a map that fell slightly over the edges. It was easy to recognize some of the things drawn there: hills, rivers, woods, but on the remainder there were numerous small blocks of wood on which were written numbers and hieroglyphs. Some of the blocks in order, some apparently chaotic. Cale stared at the map for his allotted time, then looked up. Well, said the Lord Militant. Cale began to set out his solution. 20 minutes later, he finished, his hands still held out in front of him. Very ingenious, impressive even, said the Lord Militant. Something in Cale's eyes changed, then with the extraordinary speed, the Lord Militant lashed the boy's left hand with a leather belt studded with tiny but thick tacks. Cale winced, and his teeth ground together in pain, but quickly his face returned to the watchful coldness that was all these days that the Redeemer ever saw from him. The Lord Militant sat down and considered the boy as if he were an object both interesting and yet unsatisfactory. When will you learn that to do the clever thing, the original thing, is merely your pride controlling you? This solution may work, but it's unreasonably risky. You know very well the tried solution to this problem. In a war, a dull success is always better than a brilliant one. You had better learn to understand why. He banged the table furiously. Have you forgotten that a Redeemer has the right to kill instantly any boy who does something unexpected? There was another crash as he hit the table again, stood up, and glared at Cale. Blood, not a great amount, dripped from the 4 holes in Cale's still outstretched left hand. No one else would have indulged you the way I have. The Lord of Discipline has his eye on you. Every few years, he likes to set an example. Do you want to end up as an act of faith? Cale stared ahead and said nothing. Answer me. No, Lord. Do you think you are needful, you useless Zed? No, Lord. This is my fault, my most grievous fault, said the Lord Militant, striking his breast with his hand 3 times. You have 24 hours to consider your sins, and then you will debase yourself before the Lord of Discipline. Yes, Redeemer. Now get out. Dropping his hands to his side, Cale turned and walked to the door. Don't bleed on the mat, called out the Lord Militant. Cale opened the door with his good hand and left. Alone in his cell, the Lord Militant watched the door close. As it clicked shut, his expression changed from that of barely constrained rage to one of thoughtful curiosity. Outside in the corridor, Cale stood for a moment in the horrible brown light that infected everywhere in the sanctuary, and examined his left hand. The wounds were not deep because the studs in the belt had been designed to cause intense pain without taking long to heal. He made a fist and squeezed, his head shaking as if a small tremor were taking place deep inside his skull, as the blood from his hand dripped heavily onto the floor. Then he relaxed his hand, and in the grim light a look of horrible despair crept over his face. In a moment it was gone, and Cale walked on down the corridor and out of sight. None of the boys in the sanctuary knew how many of them were there. Some claimed there were as many as 10,000 and growing more with every month. It was the increase that occupied the conversation most. Even amongst those nearing 20 years old, there was an agreement that, until the last 5 years, the number, whatever it was, had remained steady. But since then, there had been a rise. The Redeemers were doing things differently. Itself an ominous and strange thing. Habit and conformity to the past were to them like air to those who breathe. Every day should be like the next day. every month like the next month. No year should be different from another year, but now the great increase in numbers had required change. The dormitories had been altered with books of 2 and even 3 tiers to accommodate new arrivals. Divine service was held in staggered rosters so that all might pray and store up every day the tokens against damnation, and our meals were taken in relays. But as for the reasons behind this change, the boys knew nothing. Cale, Cale, his left hand wrapped in a dirty piece of linen previously thrown away by a wash chef. Wow, today I can read, guys. Do you like how well that I'm reading? I love it. It's so good. Previously thrown away by the washer serfs. Walked in through the huge refectory for the second sitting, carrying a wooden tray. Late to arrive, though not too late. For this he would have been beaten and excluded. He would have walked to the large table at the end of the room where he always ate. He stopped behind another boy, about the same age and height, but so intent on eating that he did not notice Cale standing behind him. It was the others at the table whose raised heads alerted him. He looked up. "Sorry, Cale," he said, shoving the remains of his food into his mouth at the same time as he stepped out from behind the bench and hurried off carrying his tray. Cale sat down and looked at his supper. There was something that looked like a sausage, but was not, covered in watery gravy with some indeterminate root vegetable bleached by endless boiling into a yellowy pale mush. In a bowl beside it was porridge, gelatinous and cold and grey as we called slush. For a moment, starving as he was, he couldn't bring himself to start eating, and someone pushed his way onto the bench beside him. Cale didn't look at him, but started to eat. Only the slight twitch at the edge of his mouth revealed what filthy stuff it was. The boy who had pushed in next to him started to speak, but so low was his voice that only Cale could hear. It was unwise to be caught speaking to another boy at mealtimes. "I found something," said the boy, the excitement clear, even though he was barely audible. "Good for you," replied Cale without emotion. "Something wonderful." This time, Cale did not react at all, instead concentrating on getting the porridge down without gagging. There was a pause from the boy. "There's food. Food you can eat." Cale barely raised his head, but the boy next to him knew that he had won. "Why should I believe you?" "Big Henry was with me. Meet us at 7 behind the Hanged Redeemer." With that, the boy stood up and was gone. Cale raised his head, and a strange look of longing came over his face, so different from the cold mask he usually showed the world that the boy opposite stared at him. "Don't you want that?" said the boy, eyes bright with hope, as if the rancid sausage and waxy grey porridge offered more joy than he could easily comprehend. Cale did not reply or look at the boy, but began eating again, forcing himself to swallow and trying not to be sick. When he finished, Cale took his wooden tray to the cleanorium, scrubbed it in the bowl with sand, and put it back in its rack. On his way out, watched by a redeemer sitting in a huge high chair from which he could survey the refectory, Cale knelt in front of the statue of the hanged redeemer, beat his breast 3 times, and muttered, "I am sin, I am sin, I am sin," without the slightest regard for what the words meant. Outside it was dark, and the evening fog had descended. This was good. It would make it easier for Cale to slip unnoticed from the ambo into the bushes that grew behind the great statue. By the time he arrived, Cale was unable to see more than 15 feet in front of him. He stepped down from the ambo and onto the gravel in front of the statue. This was the largest of all the holy gibbets in the sanctuary, and there must have been hundreds of them. Some of them, no larger than a few inches, nailed to the walls, set in niches, and decorating the tubs of holy ashes at the end of every corridor and on the spaces above every door. They were so common, so frequently referred to, that the image itself had long ago lost any meaning. Nobody, except the fresh boys, really noticed them for what they were. Models of a man hanging from a gallows with a rope around his neck, his body hatched with scars from the torture before his execution, his broken legs strangling at strange angle beneath him. All the gibbets of the hanged Redeemer made during the sanctuary's founding 1,000 years before were crude and tended to straightforward realism. A terror in the eyes and face for the lack of carving skill, the body twisted and racked, the tongue protruding from the mouth. This, said the carvers, was a horrible way to die. Over the years the statue had become more skilled, but also milk and water. The great statue, with its huge gallows, its thick rope, and 20-foot-tall saviour dangling from it, was only 30 years old. The wheels on the back were pronounced, but neat and bloodless. Rather than being agonizingly smashed, his legs were held in a pose as if he were suffering more from cramp, but it was the expression on his face that was the oddest of all. Instead of the pain of strangulation, he had a look of inconvenienced holiness, as if a small bone was stuck in his throat, and he was clearing it with a demure cough. Nevertheless, on this night in the fog, in the dark, the only things that Cale could see of the Redeemer were his huge feet dangling out of the white mist. The oddness of this made him uneasy. Careful not to make any noise, Cale eased himself into the bushes that obscured him from anyone walking past. Cale? Yes? The boy from the refectory, Kleist, and vague Henry emerged from the bushes in front of Cale. "This better be worth the risk, Henry," whispered Cale. "It is, Cale, I promise." Kleist gestured Cale to follow him into the bushes against the wall. It was even darker here, and Cale had to wait for his eyes to adjust. 2 others waited. There was a door. This was astonishing. While there were plenty of doorways in the sanctuary, there were few doors. During the Great Reformation 200 years before, more than half the Redeemers had been burned at the stake for heresy. Fearing that these apostates might have contaminated their boys, the victorious sect of Redeemers had cut their throats just to be on the safe side. After the restocking of fresh boys, the Redeemers had made many changes, and one of them had been to remove all the doors wherever there were boys. After all, could be the purpose of a door where there were sinners? Doors hid things. Doors were about many devil-type things, they decided, but secrecy, about being alone or with others and up to something. The very concept of a door, now that they thought of it, began to make the Redeemers shake with rage and fear. The devil himself was no longer just depicted as a horned beast, but almost as often as a rectangle with a lock. Of course, this antipathy towards doors did not apply to the Redeemers themselves. The very sign of their own redemption was the possession of a door to their place of work and their sleeping cells. Holiness for the Redeemers was measured by the number of keys they were allowed to hold on the chain around their waist. To jangle as you walked was to show that you were already being tolled to heaven. This is why the discovery of an unknown door was something amazing. Now that his eyes were becoming accustomed to the dark, Cale could see a pile of broken plaster and crumbling bricks piled next to the door. "I was hiding from Chetnik," said vague Henry. "That's how I found this place. The plaster on the corner there was falling away, so while I waited I picked at it. It was all crumbling, water had got in, and I took half a mo." Cale reached out towards the edge of the door and pushed carefully, then again and again. "It's locked." Kleist and vague Henry smiled. Kleist reached into his pocket and took out something Cale had never seen in a boy's possession. A key. It was long and thick and pitted with rust. All their eyes were shining with excitement now. Kleist put the key in the lock and turned, grunting with the effort. Then, with a clunk, it shifted. "Took us 3 days of shoveling and grease and stuff to get it open," said vague Henry, his voice thick with pride. "Where did you get the key?" asked Cale. Kleist and vague Henry were delighted that Cale were talking to them, as if they had raised the dead or walked on water. "I'll tell you when we get in. Come on." Kleist put his shoulder to the door, and the other did the same. "Don't push too hard. The hinges might be in bad shape. We don't want to make any noise. I'll count to 3. He paused. "Ready? 1, 2, 3. They pushed. Nothing. It wouldn't budge. They stopped, took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3. They heaved, and then with a screech, the door shifted. They stepped back. To be heard was to be caught. To be caught was to be the subject to God knows what. "We could be hanged for this," said Cale. The others looked at him. They wouldn't. Not a hanging. The militant told me that the Lord of Discipline was looking for an excuse to set an example. It's been 5 years since the last hanging. They wouldn't, repeated Big Henry, shocked. Yes, they would. This is a door, for God's sake. You have a key. Cale turned to Kleist. You lied to me. You've got no idea what's in there. It's probably a dead end. Nothing worth stealing. Nothing worth knowing. He looked back to the other boy. It isn't worth the risk, Henry, but it's your neck. I'm out. As he started to turn, a voice called from the armbow, angry and impatient. Who's there? What was that noise? Then they heard the sound of a man stepping onto the gravel in front of the hanged Redeemer. Never mind reading you guys to sleep, I'm reading myself to sleep. Chapter 2. Sheer terror would be mild compared to what Kleist and Henry felt as they heard that sound, the knowledge of cruelty coming to them for their stupidity. The vast and silent crowd waiting in the grey light, their screams as they were dragged to the gallows, the terrible hour, long wait, as Mass was sung, and the rope and being hauled into the air, choking and kicking. But Cale had already moved over to the door, and with one silent surge of effort lifted the door up from its collapsing hinges and pushed. It swung open almost silently. He reached for the shoulders of the 2 motionless boys and pushed them into the gap. Once they were in, he squeezed himself in after them, and with another huge effort shut the door behind him, almost silently. "Come out, at once." The sound of the man's voice was muffled, but still clear. "Give me the key," said Cale. Kleist handed it over. Cale turned to the door and felt for the lock, then he paused. He did not know how to use the key. "Kleist, he whispered. Kleist felt for the lock and slipped in the heavy key. "Quietly," said Cale. With a trembling hand, he knew that what it was doing was life or death. Kleist twisted the key. It turned with what seemed to be, to them, the clang of a hammer on an iron pot. "Come here now," demanded the muffled voice, but Cale could hear that there was uncertainty in it. Whoever was out there in the fog was unsure what he had heard. They waited, in the silence, only the light rasp of breathing of the fearful. Then they could just make out the muffled crunch of gravel as the man turned away, the sound quickly swallowed up. "He's gone for the gouges." "Perhaps not," said Cale. "I think it was the Lord of Victuals. He's an idle fat bastard, and he wasn't sure what he'd heard. He could have searched the bushes, but he wouldn't make the effort. He'll beware of getting the gouges out with the dogs when he wasn't even ready to check behind a few bushes because of the strain on his lardy carcass. If he comes back tomorrow when it's light, he'll find the door," said Big Henry. "Even if we escape now, they'll come after us. They'll come after someone, and they'll make sure they find them, whether they're guilty or not. There's nothing to connect us with this place. Someone will take it in the neck, but there's no reason it should be us." "What if he's gone for help?" said Kleist. "Unlock the door. Let's get out." Kleist felt for the door and patted his way down to the key sticking out the lock. He tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. He tried again. Nothing. Then he twisted as hard as he could. There was a loud snap. "What was that?" demanded Big Henry. "The key," said Kleist. "It's broken off in the lock." "What?" said Cale. "It's broken. We can't get out. Not this way." "God!" swore Cale. "You half-wit. If I could see you, I'd wring your neck." "There might be another way out." "And how are we going to find it in the pitch black?" said Cale bitterly. "I have a light," said Kleist. "Thought we'd need one." There was a pause, with only the ruffling of Kleist searching his cassock, dropping something, finding it again, and then some more ruffling. Then there were sparks as he struck a flint under some dry moss. Quickly it began to flame, and in its light they could see Kleist touching it to the wick of a carrying candle. In a moment he had inserted it into a glass cap, and they could look around for the first time. It's true there was not much to be seen in the light of the carrying candle. only a poor illumination is to be had from the yellow rendered fat of animal meat, but it was clear to the boys that as soon as they looked around that this was not a room, but a blocked-off corridor. Cale took the light from Kleist and examined the door. The plaster isn't that old, a few years at most. In the corner something scuttled, and the three of them had the same thoughts. Rats. The eating of rats was forbidden to the boys on religious grounds, but this was at least one taboo with a good reason behind it. They were disease on 4 legs. Nevertheless, the meat of a rat was considered a great treat by the boys. Of course, not everyone could be a rat butcher. The skill was much prized, and was passed from butcher to trainee in exchange only for expensive swag and mutual favours. The rat butchers were a secretive lot, and charged half the rat for their services, a price so high that from time to time some catchers had decided to dispense with them and try butchering for themselves, often with results that encouraged others to pay up and be grateful. Kleist was a trained butcher. "We don't have time," said Cale, realising what was on his mind, "and the light isn't good enough to prepare one." "I can skin a rat in pitch black," replied Kleist. "Who knows how long we'll be stuck?" He pulled up his cassock and removed a large pebble from a pocket hidden in the hem. He took careful aim, and then lashed it into the semi-dark. In the corner there was a squeal and a horrible scuffling. Kleist took the candle from Cale and walked towards the sound. He reached from his pocket with great care and unfolded a small piece of cloth and used it to get hold of the creature. With a flick of his wrist, he snapped its neck and then put it in the same pocket. "I'll finish later." "This is a corridor," said Cale. "It must have led somewhere once. Maybe it still does." As one with the candle, Kleist took the lead. After less than a minute, Cale began to revise his opinions. No doorways, bricked up or otherwise, appeared, as Cale had hoped. "This isn't a corridor," said Cale at last, still keeping his voice low. "It's more like a tunnel." For more than half an hour they walked on and moved quickly, despite the dark, because the floor was almost completely smooth and clear of rubbish. Eventually, it was Cale who spoke. "Why did you tell me there was food when you'd never even been here?" "Obvious," said vague Henry. "You wouldn't have come otherwise, would you? And how stupid would that have been? You promised me food, Kleist. I was an idiot enough to trust you." "I thought you were famous, you know, for not trusting people," said Kleist. "Besides, we have a rat. I didn't lie. There is food." "How do you know?" said Henry, his voice betraying his hunger. "There are a lot more rats. Rats need to eat. They have to get it from somewhere." Kleist stopped suddenly. "What's the matter?" said Henry. Kleist held out the candle. In front of them was a wall. There was no door. "Maybe it's behind the plaster," said Kleist. Cale felt the wall with the palm of his hand, then tapped it with his knuckle. "That's not plaster. It's rice flour and concrete, same as the outer walls. There'll be no breaking through this." "Maybe we'll have to go back. Maybe we missed a door in the side of the tunnel. We weren't looking for that." "I don't think so," said Cale. "Beside, how long will the candle burn for?" Kleist looked at the tallow he was holding. 20 minutes. "What'll we do?" "Put the candle out and let's have a think," said Cale. "Good idea," said Kleist. "Happy you think so," muttered Cale, and sat down on the floor. Having sat down himself, Kleist opened the glass and extinguished the flame between his thumb and forefinger. They sat in the dark, all three of them distracted by the smell of the animal fat from the candle. For them, the stench of burned, rancid tallow was a reminder of one thing: food. After 5 minutes, vague Henry spoke. "I was just—" His sentence tailed off. The other two waited. "This is one end of a tunnel." Again he paused. "But there has to be more than one way to get into a tunnel." His voice faltered off. "Just a thought." "A thought," said Kleist. "Don't flatter yourself." Henry did not reply, but Cale got to his feet. "Light the candle." It took a minute for Kleist with his moss and flint, but as soon as they were able to see again, Cale sank onto his haunches. "Give it to Henry and get on my shoulders." Kleist handed the candle over, and then clambered onto Cale's back, and settled his legs around his neck. With a grunt, Cale pushed him into the air. "Take the light." Kleist did as he was told. then look up by the roof. Clyde raised the candle, looking for something, with any idea what it was. "Yes!" he shouted. "Be quiet, damn you!" "It's a hatch," he whispered, overjoyed. "Can you reach it?" "Yes. I don't even have to stretch hardly." "Be careful, just a gentle push. There might be someone around." Clyde placed his palm at the nearest edge of the hatch and pushed. It moved. Try and push it away. Try and see something. There was a scraping sound. "Nothing. It's dark. I'll put the candle up there." There was a pause. "I still can't see much." "Can you get up?" "If you push my feet, when I grab the edge. Now." Cale grabbed his feet and heaved upwards. Clyde slowly moved and pulled away to the sound of the hatch clattering above them. "Keep it quiet," hissed Cale, but Clyde was gone. Cale and Henry waited in the dark, illuminated by the faint glow from the hatch above. Even this grew dim as Clyde searched his surroundings. Then it went dark. "Do you think we can trust him to clear off?" "Well," said vague Henry, "I think." He paused. "Probably." But he didn't finish. The light appeared on the hatch again, followed by Clyde's head. "It's some sort of room, but I can see light through another hatch." "Get on my shoulders," said Cale to vague Henry. "What about you?" "I'll be fine. Just both of you wait up there to pull me up." Vague Henry was much lighter than Kleist, and it was easy enough to lift him up to the hatch where Kleist could haul him through. "Hang the candle as far down as you can." Kleist lowered himself while vague Henry held on to his feet. Cale went to the wall of the tunnel, reached up to a crack in the wall, and pulled himself up. Then he found another and another until he was able to reach towards Kleist's hand. They clasped each other's wrist. "You were right for this." "Worry about yourself, Cale. I'm going to give Henry the candle." He turned his hand back to vague Henry, half his body length dangling out of the hatch, and the light disappeared back up into the darkness. "On my count of 3, he paused. 1, 2, 3. Cale let go and swung out into midair, a hefty grunt from Kleist as he took his weight. He hung for a moment, waiting for the swinging to stop. Then with his free arm, he reached up and pulled on Kleist's shoulder as Henry heaved on his legs. They shifted only 6 inches, but it was enough for Cale to grab the edge of the hatch and ease the weight on Kleist and Henry. He held for a moment, and then he was pulled through the hatch and onto the wooden floor. The 3 of them lay there panting with the effort. Then Cale stood up. "Show me the other hatch." Getting to his feet, Kleist picked up the now nearly vanished candle and went over to the other side of a room that looked to Cale to be about 20 feet by 15. Kleist bent down next to a hatch, followed by the other 2. There was, as he'd said, a crack to one side. Cale put his eye as close as he could, but beyond the fact that there was light, he was able to see nothing in detail. Then he put his ear to the crack. "What do you... Be quiet," hissed Cale. He kept his ear to the floor for a good 2 minutes. Then he sat up and went to the hatch. There was no obvious way to lift it, so he felt around the edges until he found enough of a gaff to pull the hatch towards itself. The fix slipped. To pull the hatch itself towards the fixed lip. It gave slightly, making a grating noise. Cale winced with irritation. There wasn't enough room for even a finger, so he had to push his fingernails into the wood to get any kind of purchase. It hurt as he pulled at the edge, but then he eased it upwards enough to get his hand underneath. He lifted the hatch away from its frame, and then all 3 of them looked down. About 15 feet below them was a sight unlike anything they had ever experienced. Indeed, more than any they had ever dreamed of. I wonder what it is they found. Chapter 3. Absolutely still, absolutely silent, the 3 boys continued to stare down into the kitchen, for that's what it was. Every surface was covered in plates of food. There was roast chicken with its crispy skin rubbed in salt and ground pepper, beef in thick slices, pork with crackling so crisp to bite it would make the sound of a dry stick being broken. There was bread, thick sliced with crust so dark it was almost black in places. There were plates piled up with onions tinged with purple and rice with fruits, fat raisins and apples. There were puddings, meringues like mountains, custards of deep yellow, and bowls of clotted cream. The boys had no words for most of what they saw. Why have a word for custard when you had never even imagined the existence of such a thing? Or think that the slabs of beef and breasts of sliced chicken bone bore any relation to the scraps of giblets and feet and brain boiled together and minced into awful tubes. That was their only taste of meat. Think of how strange the colours and sights of the world would be for a blind man abruptly made to see, or a man deaf from birth, hearing the playing of 100 flutes. But confused and amazed as they were, hunger drove them out the hatch like monkeys, swinging away from the table and into the middle of the kitchen. All three stood astonished at the abundance around them. Even Cale almost forgot that the hatch had to be closed. In a daze of smells and sweet colours, he took some of the plates off the table and stood up. With his hand stretched to the furthest limit, he was able to push the hatch across so that it fell into place. By the time he was back on the floor, the other two were already plundering the food with the skill of long-practiced scavengers. They took only one thing from each plate and rearranged the gaps so it appeared nothing was gone. They couldn't resist a few bits of chicken or bread, but most of what they took went into the forbidden pockets that they had stitched into their cassocks to hide any contraband that they came across that could be easily stolen and hidden. Cale felt sick with the rich smells that seemed to surge in his brain and make him want to faint, as if they were baited with strange vapours. Don't eat, just take what you can hide. He was instructing himself as much as the others. He took his share and hid what he filched, but there were few pockets to hide it in. They had no need of many hiding places, the pickings in their ordinary life being so thin and scanty. We have to get out, now. Cale walked towards the door, as if they'd been woken from a deep sleep. Kleist and vague Henry began to realize how much danger they were in. Cale listened at the door for a moment, and then eased it open. It was a corridor. God knows where we are, he said, but we have to find cover. With that, he pulled the door open and walked out, the others warily following. They moved quickly, keeping close to the walls. Within a few yards, they came across a staircase leading upwards. Cale shook his head as vague Henry made his way over to it. We need to find a window or get outside to see if we can find out where we are. We have to get back to the sleep shed before candle out, or they'll know we're gone. They moved on, but as they approached the door on the left, it began to open. In an instant, they turned and fled back to the stairs and ran to the top. All three flattened themselves on the landing as they heard voices pass beneath them along the corridor. They heard the sound of another door being opened, and Cale raised his head only to see a figure heading into the kitchen from which they had just come. Vague Henry moved beside him. He looked confused and afraid. "Those voices," he whispered. "What was wrong with them?" Cale shook his head, but he too had noticed how strange they were, and felt a peculiar movement in his stomach. He stood up, scanning the place where they were hiding. There was nowhere to go except through a door behind them. Quickly, he turned the handle and eased into the room behind it. Except that it wasn't a room, it was a balcony of some kind, with a low wall 10 feet or so from the door. Cale crawled towards it, with the others doing the same thing until they were all crouched behind the wall. From the space overlooked by the balcony, there was a burst of laughter and applause. But it was not just the laughter that spooked the three boys, for all that laughter was something rarely heard in a place that never in such volume and with such easy joy. It was much more the pitch and sound of it, like the voices they had heard in the corridor a few moments before. It set off an alien thrill deep inside in them. "Look and see," whispered vague Henry. "No," mouthed Cale. "You must, or I will." Cale grabbed his wrist and squeezed. "If we're caught, we're dead." Vague Henry, reluctant, eased back against the balcony wall. There was another burst of laughter, but this time Cale kept his eye on vague Henry. Then he noticed that Kleist had moved onto his knees and was looking down, fascinated at the source of so much careless joy. Laughter for an acolyte was something droll, laconic, bitter. He tried to pull him back, but Clyde was much stronger than Vic Henry, and it was impossible to budge him without using so much force that they would have revealed themselves instantly. Cale slowly raised his head over the balcony wall and looked down at something far more shocking and disturbing than the sight of food in the kitchen. It was as everything inside him was being battered with hundreds of the Redeemer's nail sticks. Below, in a large hall, were about a dozen tables, all covered in the same food they'd seen in the kitchen. The tables were arranged in circles so that everyone seated could see each other. It seemed obvious that 2 girls dressed in pure white were the cause of the celebration. One of these girls in particular was striking, with long dark hair and deep green eyes. She was beautiful, but also as plump as a cushion. In the middle of the circle of tables was a large pool full of hot water, mists of steam clinging to its surface. There was a half-dozen or so girls in the pool who froze at the wide-eyed expression on Cale and Clyde's faces, a look as shocked and bewildered as if they had come upon a sight of heaven itself. The girls in the pool were naked, but they were pink or brown, according to their origin, but all were curved and voluptuous. But it was not their nakedness that so amazed the boys as the fact that they had never seen a woman before. Who could capture what they felt? The poet does not exist. Who could put into words the terrible joy, the shock, and awe? There was a gasp, this time from Vic Henry, who was now beside the other 2. The noise brought Cale back to his right mind. He slumped down and rested against the wall. In a few seconds the others, pale and distraught, did the same. "Wonderful," whispered Vic Henry to himself. "Wonderful, wonderful, most wonderful. We have to go or we're dead." Cale slipped onto his hands and knees and crawled to the door, the others following. They slipped out and crept to the edge of the landing and listened. Nothing. Then they made their way down the stairs and began to walk down the corridor. Luck was with them, because there was nothing left of the skilled and cautious boys who had made their way to the balcony and the shocking scenes beneath. Then, shaking in an enraptured state, they made it to a doorway that led to another corridor. They turned to the left because they had no better reason to go to the right. Another 3 of them, with just half an hour to get back to the sleep shed, broke into a wall and run. In less than a minute, they came to a sharp turn. It was 20 feet long, and at the end was a thick door. The faces fell in despair. "Dear God," whispered Vic Henry. "In 40 minutes they'll have the gougers out looking for us. It won't take them long, will it? Stuck in here. And then what? They won't let us tell what we've seen here," said Kleist. "Then we have to leave," said Cale. "Leave? As in go away and never come back?" "We can't even get out of here," said Kleist, "and you're talking about escaping from the sanctuary altogether?" "What choice do we?" But Cale's reply was cut short by the sound of the key turning the lock of the door in front of them. It was a huge door, at least 6 inches thick, so there were a few seconds for them to find a hiding place, except that there wasn't one. Cale signalled the other 2 to flatten themselves against the wall where the opening door would hide them, if only until it was shut. But they had no choice. To run back was to be struck where they were, until their absence was discovered, followed by a quick capture and a slow death. The door swung open, the result of some effort, if the swearing and groaning of imitation were anything to go by, accompanied by more bad-tempered muttering. The door moved towards them, and then stopped. And a small wedge of wood was forced under the door to keep it open. More cursing and groaning followed, and then there was a sound of a small cart being pushed down the corridor. Cale, who was on the edge of the side of the door, looked out and saw a familiar figure in a black cassock, limping away as he pushed the cart and then disappeared around the corner. Cale signalled the others out, and moved quickly through the door. They were outside in the cold fog. There's another cart filled with coal waiting to be taken in, and that was why, under Redeemer Smith, lazy bastard as always, had jammed the door open rather than lock it as he must have been instructed to do. Normally, they would have stolen as much coal as they could carry, but their pockets were full of food, and they were too afraid in any case. "Where are we?" asked Vic Henry. "No idea," replied Cale. He moved down the ambo, trying to get used to the fog and the dark in order to find a landmark, but now the relief at the deliverance was fading. They'd walked a long way in the tunnel. They could be anywhere in the sanctuary and its maze of buildings and ambos and corridors. The a huge pair of feet loomed out of the fog, and it was the great statue of the hanged Redeemer that they had left behind more than an hour ago. Within less than 5 minutes they, separately, joined the queue for the sleep shed, more formally known as the dormitory of the Lady of Perpetual Succour. What any of this meant they knew not and cared less. They began chanting along with the others. What if I should die tonight? What if I should die tonight? What if I should die tonight? The answer to this dismal question had been made pretty clear to the acolytes all their lives by their redeemers. Most of them would go to hell because of the disgusting black state of their souls and be burnt for all eternity. For years, when the subject of their dying in the middle of the night came up, and it came up often, Cale frequently halted to the front of the group, and the Redeemer in charge would raise his cassock up to reveal his naked back and show the bruises that covered it from knee to sacroiliac. I did not read that word right. Sacroiliac. There we go. The bruises were of many sizes, and while going through the various states of healing, his back was sometimes beautiful to behold, with so many variations of blue and grey and greens, vermilion and reds, and almost gold and purple yellows. Look at those colours, the Redeemer would say. Your soul should be as white as a turtle's wing. Are as worse than the blacks and purples on this boy's back. And this is what all of you look like to God, purple and black. And if any of you dies tonight, you don't need me to tell you what line you'll be forming. As for what's waiting at the end of that line, there are beasts to eat you and shit you out and eat you yet again. There are metal ovens waiting, heated red, and you'll be baked to cinders for an hour, then rendered down to fat, then kneaded by a devil, ash and lard together like an ugly dough, then be born again, and then be burnt again, and born and burnt for all eternity. Once, a visiting dignitary, one Redeemer Compton, who was opposed to Bosco, had witnessed this demonstration and also seen one of the beatings that had caused the bruises. These boys, said the Redeemer Compton, are being shaped to fight the blasphemy of the antagonist. Violence so extreme against a child, no matter how much he has become the devil's playground, will break his spirit long before it will make it tough enough to help us wipe their sacrilege from the sight of God. He is not unruly, and he is very far from being the playground of the devil. Bosco, always so very guarded when it came to discussing Cale, was instantly angry with himself at being provoked, even to so enigmatic an explanation. Then why do you allow this? Do not ask the reason. Be satisfied. Tell me, Redeemer. I say I will not. And at this, Redeemer Compton, wiser for once than Bosco, held his tongue, but later instructed 2 of his pale squealers at the sanctuary to pick up whatever they could about the purple-backed boy. What if I should die tonight? What if I should die tonight? What if I should die tonight? As Cale and the others muttered their way to bed, the chant that years of repetition had rendered almost empty of meaning renewed the dreadful power it had had over them as young children, when they would lie awake all night, convinced that merely the closing of their eyes would see them feeling the hot mouths, I do like reading, reading is very fun. Sometimes I wish that I could read coherently. When they would lie awake all night, convinced that merely the closing of their eyes would see them feeling the hot mouth of the beast or hearing the charred clash of the metal oven doors. There we go. Within 10 minutes the huge shed was full, and the doors locked as 500 boys in absolute silence prepared to sleep in the vast, freezing, and dimly lit barn. Then the candles were put out, and the boys began to prepare for a sleep that came quickly. They had been awake since 5 o'clock that morning. The dormitory settled into a noisy mixture of snores, weeping, yelps, and grunts, as the boys fled into whatever comfort or horrid horror waited for them in their dreams. 3 boys, of course, did not fall asleep quickly, nor did they do so for many hours. 4 to chapter 5 is quite long. There's like 12 pages. Oh dear. I'm resting my voice, don't mind me. Oh dear. Chapter 4. I'll be doing the same thing with the second book as I do the first book, where I read 5 chapters and then stop, because it seems like a sensible thing to do. So this will be the last chapter, and then I will stop streaming. Cale woke early. This had been his habit for as long as he could remember. It gave him an entire hour to be on his own, as far as anyone could be alone with 500 sleeping boys in the same room. But in the dark before dawn, no one talked to him, watched him, told him what to do, threatened him, or looked for an excuse to beat or even kill him. And even if he was hungry, there was at least warm under his blanket. And then, of course, he remembered the food. His pockets were full of it. It was reckless to reach for the cassock hanging by his bed, but he was driven by something irresistible. Not just hunger, because he lived with that constantly, but delight, the thought, the unbearable pleasure of eating something that tasted so wonderful. Taking his time, he reached into his pocket and took the first thing he found there, a kind of plain biscuit with a custard layer, and shoved it into his mouth. At first he thought he would go wild with delight, the flavours of sugar and butter exploding not only in his mouth, but in his brain, indeed in his very soul. He chewed on and swallowed, pleasure beyond words. And then, of course, he felt sick. He was no more used to food like this than an elephant is to flying through the air. Like a man dying of thirst or from lack of food, he needed to be fed stingy drops and morsels, or his body would rebel and die of the very thing it so desperately needed. Cale lay there for half an hour and tried very hard not to vomit. As he began to recover, he could hear the sound of one of the Redeemers walking his rounds before wake up. The hard soles of his shoes clacked on the stone floor as he circled the sleeping boys. This went on for 10 minutes. Then suddenly, a quickening of pace and loud claps. Get up, get up. Cale, still queasy, eased himself upright and began to pull on his cassock, careful not to let anything spill from his overfull pockets, as the 500 groaned and staggered their way to their feet. A few minutes later, they marched through the rain to assemble in the great stone Basilica of Eternal Mercy, where they spent the next 2 hours muttering prayers in response to the 10 Redeemers holding Mass, using words that had long ago become empty from redemption. Cale didn't mind this. He had learned as a small boy to sleep with his eyes open and mutter along with the rest, only a small part of his mind keeping wary, alert for Redeemers on the lookout for slackers. Then it was breakfast, more grey porridge and dead men's feet, a kind of cake made from many kinds of animal and vegetable fat, usually rancid, and numerous varieties of seed. It was revolting, but highly nutritious. It was only because of this disgusting mixture the boys survived at all. The Redeemers wished them to have as little pleasure in life as possible, but their plans for the future, for a great war against the antagonists, meant that the boys had to be strong, those who lived, of course. It was not until 8 o'clock, as they queued for practice on the field of our Redeemers of Absolute Forgiveness. Bloody hell. They do like their long names, don't they? It's like a light novel up in here. Field of our Redeemer's Absolute Forgiveness. Really? As the three were able to talk again. I feel sick, said Kleist. Me too, whispered Vague Henry. Nearly threw up, admitted Cale. Gonna have to hide it. Or throw it away. I'll get used to it, said Cale. Anyway, I'll have yours if you don't want it. Pardon me. I have to fold the vestments after practice, said Vague Henry. Give me the food and I'll hide it in there. Talking, you boys, talking. In his usual miraculous way, Redeemer Malik had appeared behind them. It was unwise to be doing anything wrong when Malik was around because of his strange ability to creep up on people. It had announced taking over the training session from Redeemer Fitzsimmons, known universally as Fitz the Shits because of the dysentery that had plagued him since his time in the Fen campaigns. It was just bad luck. I want 200, said Malik, fetching Kleist a heavy clip round the back of the head. He made his entire line, not just 3 of them, get down on their knuckles and start to do their allotted press-ups. Not you, Cale, said Malik. Balance on your hands. Cale moved easily into a handstand and started to push up and down, with the exception of Kleist. The faces of the others in the line were already frowning under the strain, but Cale kept moving up and down as if he might never stop, his eyes blank, 1,000 miles away. Kleist made her look bored, though, completely at ease, while moving twice as fast as the others. When a lot of them had finished, exhausted and in pain, Malik made Cale do 20 more for showing bodily pride. I told you to balance on your hands, not to do press-ups as well. The pride of a boy is a tasty snack for the devil. This was a moral lesson lost on the acolytes in front of him, who stared at him blankly. The experience of a light but refreshing meal between other meals, tasty or otherwise, was something they had never imagined, let alone experienced. When the bell went to signal the end of practice, 500 boys walked as slowly as they dared back to the basilicate for morning prayers. As they passed by the alley leading into the back of the great building, the 3 boys slipped away. They gave all the food in their pockets to Vague Henry, and then Kleist and Cale rejoined the long queue that jammed in the square in front of the basilicate. Meanwhile, Vague Henry shoved the latch on the sacristy door with his shoulders, his hands being full of bread, meat and cake. He pushed it open and listened out for Redeemers. He moved into the dark brown of the dressing place, ready to back out if he saw anything. It seemed to be empty. He rushed over to one of the cupboards, but he had to dump some of the food on the floor in order to open it. A bit of dirt, he reflected, never harmed anyone. With the door open, he reached inside the cupboard and lifted a plank of wood from the floor. Underneath was a large space in which Vague Henry kept his belongings, all of them forbidden. The acolytes were not permitted to own anything in case it made them, as Redeemer Pig put it, lust after the material things of this world. Pig, it should be added, was not his real name, which was Redeemer Glebe. It was Glebe's voice, and I rang out behind him. "Who's that?" 3/4 hidden by the cupboard door, Vague Henry shoveled the food in his arms and the chicken legs and cake from the floor into the cupboard, and standing up, shut the door. "I beg your pardon, Redeemer." "Oh, it's you," said Glebe. "What are you doing?" "What am I doing, Redeemer?" "Yes," said Glebe irritated. Well... Vague Henry looked around as if for inspiration. He seemed to find it somewhere in the roof. "I was putting away the long habiliment left by Redeemer Bent." Redeemer Bent was certainly mad, but his reputation for forgetfulness was largely due to the fact that whenever they got a chance, the acolytes blamed him for everything that was misplaced, or was questionable about whatever they were doing. If they were caught doing something, or being somewhere they shouldn't, the acolytes' first line of defense was that they were at the command of Redeemer Bent, whose poor short-term memory could be relied upon not to conduct them. "Bring me my habiliments." Vague Henry looked at Glebe as if he'd never heard such a thing. "Well, what?" "Habiliments?" asked Vague Henry, as Glebe was about to step forward and give him a clout. Vague Henry said brightly, "Of course, Redeemer." He turned and walked over to another of the cupboards and flung it open with huge, Enthusiasm. Black or white, Redeemer? What's the matter with you? The matter, Redeemer? Yes, you idiot. Why would I wear black habiliments on a weekday during the month of the dead? On a weekday? Said vague Henry, as if astonished by such a notion. Of course not, Redeemer. You'll need a thrannoc, though. What are you talking about? Glebe's querulous tone was also uncertain. There were hundreds of ceremonial robes and ornaments, many having fallen into disuse over thousands of years since the founding of the sanctuary. He had, it was clear, never heard of a thrannoc. That didn't mean that such a thing didn't exist. Vague Henry went over to a drawer and pulled it open, watched by Redeemer Glebe. He searched for a moment and then pulled out a necklace made of tiny beads, at which end was a small square made out of sacking. It is to be worn on Martyr Fulton's Day. I've never worn anything like that before, said Glebe, still uncertain. He walked over to the... Wow. You know when you see a word and you can process it in your head, but you can't quite process it out loud? You know, just that word. Yep. The ecclesiasticum, I'm going to pretend that's how it's said, and opened it at that day's date. It was indeed Martyr Fulton's Day, but then there were so many martyrs and not enough days. As a result, some of the minor ones were celebrated every 20 years or so. Glebe sniffed irritably. Get a move on, we're late. With you some solemnity, vague Henry placed the thrannoc around Glebe's neck and helped him into the long, wide, elaborately decorated habiliment. This done, he followed Glebe out into the Basilia, proper for morning prayers, where he spent the next half an hour pleasurably reliving the episode with the thrannoc, something he did not exist outside of vague Henry's imagination. He had no idea what the square of sack on the end of the beaded string was for, but there were numerous of such unknown bits and bobs in the sacristy whose religious significance had been long forgotten. Nevertheless, he had, and not for the first time, taken an enormous risk just for the pleasure of making a fool out of a redeemer. If he were ever found out, they would have a hide off his back, and this was no figure of speech. His nickname, given to him by Cale, had caught on, but only the two of them realized what it truly meant. No one except Cale realized that Henry's elusive way of answering or repeating any question he was asked was not due to his inability to understand what was said to him, or to give clear replies, but merely a way of defying the Redeemers by pushing his response to them to the very limit of their not very great tolerance. It was because Cale had come to see what Henry was up to and admire its spectacular recklessness that he had broken one of his most important rules. Make no friends. Allow no one to make friends with you. At that moment, Cale was making his way into a spare pew in Basilia number 4, looking forward to catching up on his sleep during the prayers of the basement. He had perfected the art of dozing while lambasting himself for his sins of turpitude, of delectatio morosa, sins of gaudium, of desiderium, sense of desire, effacious and ineffacious in unison in the 500 children in the Basilica Tower. 4. Vowed never to commit transgressions that would have been impossible for them, even if they'd know what they were. 5-year-olds swore solemnly never to covet their neighbour's wife. 9-year-olds vowed that under no circumstances would they carve graven images, and 14-year-olds promised not to worship these images, even if they did carve them. All of this under pain of God's punishing their children, even to the 3rd or 4th generation. After a satisfying 45-minute doze, the mass ended, and Cale filed out silently with the others and made his way back to the far end of the training field. The field was never empty during the day now. The huge increase in the number of acolytes under instruction in the last 5 years had meant that almost everything now was done in shifts. Training, eating, washing, worshipping. Training took place even at night for those thought to be falling behind, and was particularly hated because of the terrible cold. The wind of the scablands like a knife even in summer. It was no secret that this increase was to provide more troops for the war against the antagonists. Cale knew that many of those who left the sanctuary were not going permanently to the eastern front, but were being held most of the time in reserve and rotated for 6 months to either front, with up to a year, or longer back in reserve in between. He knew this because Bosco had told him. "You may ask 2 questions," said Bosco after he had informed about the strange deployment. Cale had considered for a moment. "The time they spend in reserve, Lord, do you plan to increase it and keep it on increasing it?" "Yes," said Bosco. "Second question." "I don't need a second question," replied Cale. "Really? You'd better be right then, hadn't you? I heard Redeemer Compton say to you that there was a stalemate at the front." "Yes, I could see you earwigging at the time. And yet you both talked around as if it wasn't a problem." "Go on." "You've trained a great number of priests militant in the last 5 years. Too many. You're trying to give them a go at fighting, but you don't want the antagonists to know that you've been building up your forces. That's why the time in reserve has been increasing. We're always being told that there are antagonist traitors everywhere at the fronts. Isn't that true?" "Ah," Bosco smiled. "Not a pleasant sight. A second question, while all the time boasting that you needed only one. Your vanity will destroy you, boy, and I don't mean that for the good of your soul." "I have—" He stopped, and as if he were uncertain what to say next. Something that Cale had never seen before. It was disturbing. "I have expectations of you. Demands will be made, and it will be much better if you were thrown off the walls of this place within a millstone around your neck, than if you failed to meet those demands and those expectations, and it is your pride that most worries me. Every other Redeemer from here to eternity will tell you that pride is the cause of all the other 28 deadly sins, but I have bigger fish to fry than your soul. It distorts your judgment and makes you put yourself in situations that you could have avoided. I gave you 2 questions, and for no reason but vain superbia, you wanted to best me and risked a punishment for failing that you need not have risked. It makes you weak in such a way that I wonder whether you have deserved my protection for all these years." He stared at Cale, and Cale stared at the floor, all the while hating and sneering at the idea of Bosco protecting him. Strange and perilous thoughts went through his mind as he waited. "The answer to your second question is that there are antagonist spies and intelligences at the front, but only a few. Enough, however." Cale kept his eyes on the floor, pretended not to resist, minimized the punishment, yet all the while raging resentment that Bosco was right and that he might have avoided what was coming up. "You're building up reserves for a great attack on both fronts, and yet you must keep the numbers there more or less the same level, or they'll see what's coming. You want the reserves to get experience, but there are now too many, so they have to spend more time away from the front, and yet you need many more soldiers to finish off the antagonists. But they must be battle-hardened, and there aren't enough battles. You're in a bind, Lord. Your solution?" "I'll need time, Redeemer. There may not be a solution that isn't another problem." Bosco laughed. "Let me tell you, boy, the solution to every problem is always another problem." Then, without warning, Bosco lashed out at Cale. Cale blocked it as easily as if it were aimed by an old man. They looked at each other. "Put your hands down," and Cale did as he was told. "I will hit you again in a moment," said Bosco softly, "and when I do, you will not move your hands, and you will not move your head. You will let me strike you, you will allow it, you will consent." Cale waited. Bosco this time made a clear show of his preparation for the blow. Then he hit out again. Cale flinched, but the blow did not land. Bosco's hand stopped a fraction from Cale's fate. "Don't you move, boy." Bosco drew his hand back and again lashed out. Yet again Cale flinched. "Don't you move," screamed Bosco, his face red with rage except for 2 very small white spots in the centre of his cheeks, which grew whiter as the skin on his face went ever darker. Then another blow, but this one landed as Cale stood still as stone. Then another, and another, then a blow so hard it dropped a stunned Cale to the floor. Get up, so softly that it was barely audible. Cale got to his feet, shaking as if from intense cold, then the blow. He fell again, stood up, another blow, then he got to his feet again. Bosco changed hands. With his weaker left, it took 5 more blows before Cale fell to the floor again. Bosco stared down at him as he started to get to his feet. Both of them were shaking now. Stay where you are, Bosco was almost whispering. If you get up, I won't answer for what will happen. I'm going. He seemed almost bewildered, exhausted by the dreadful intensity of his anger. Wait for 5 minutes, and then leave. Then Bosco went to the door and was gone. For a full minute, Cale did not move. Then he was sick. It took another minute of rest, and then 3 more to clean up the mess. Then slowly, shaking, as if he might never reach it, he got to the corridor, and supporting himself by feeling a way along its wall, he made his way out of one of the blind alleys of a courtyard and sat down. Keep your waist straight. No, no, no. Cale snapped back from what had become almost a trance. The noises and sights of the training field had vanished, and he had gone missing in his memories of the past. It was something that was happening more often, but it was not a good idea to become so distracted in a place like the sanctuary. He paid attention here, or pretty quickly something unpleasant happened. All around him, the sights and sounds of training were vivid now. A line of 20 acolytes, soon to leave, were practicing an attack in formation. Redeemer Gil, known as Gil the Gorilla because of his ugliness and terrible strength, was complaining routinely about the sloppiness of his trainees. Have the gates of death been shown to you, Gavin? He said wearily. They will be if you keep exposing your left side like that. The acolytes in the line smiled at Gavin's discomfort. For all his physical power and brute ugliness, Redeemer Gil was as close to being a decent man as a Redeemer ever got. Except for Redeemer Nevrattle. He was a peculiar case. Night training for you, Gil said to the hapless Gavin. The boy next to him laughed. And you can join him, Gregor. And you, Holdaway. Just beyond the line, a small boy, no more than 7 years old, was hanging by his arms from a wooden frame about 7 feet off the ground. A belt of heavy weights and canvas was strapped around his shins, and he was grimacing, tears of pain rolling down his contorted face. The under-redeemer beneath him kept insisting that unless he raised his weighted feet to make a perfect L shape every time, none of his efforts would count. Crying won't do any good, only doing it right will do any good. As the child struggled to do as he was told, Cale noticed the extreme definition of the 6 muscles of his stomach as he strained, bulging and powerful as those of a grown man. 4, counted the Redeemer. Cale walked on, past boys of 5, some laughing like little boys anywhere, and 18-year-olds who looked like middle-aged men. There were groups of 80 or so practicing pushing each other back and forth, shouting in a rhythm, as if they were one giant grunting against another. An additional rank of 500 or so marched in formation without a sound, turning, as one, to the signalling of flags, left, then right, then stopping dead, then retreating, then stopping again, and moving forward. By now, Cale was about 50 yards from the great wall around the sanctuary, at the edge of the archery range where Kleist was giving lip to a squad of 10 acolytes, easily 4 years older than himself. He was abusing them for their uselessness, their ugliness, the lack of skill, the poor quality of their teeth, and the fact that their eyes were too close together. He stopped only when he saw Cale. "You're late," he said. "Look, if you that Primo was sick, or he'd have your hide. You could always try if you like. Me, I couldn't care if you were here or not. You're lost." Cale's faint shrug in response indicated a reluctant acknowledgement that this was probably true. Kleist was stripped to the waist, revealing a markable, if odd, body shape. He seemed to be all back and shoulders, as if the upper body of an adult male had been inserted between the legs and head of a 14-year-old. His right arm and shoulder in particular was so much more knotted with muscle than his left side that he looked almost deformed. "Right," said Kleist, "let's have a look at what's wrong." He was clearly enjoying the chance to demonstrate a sense of superiority, and very keen that Cale should know he was enjoying it too. Cale raised the longbow Kleist had handed him, pulled back the drawstring to his cheek, aimed, held for a second, and then loosed the arrow to its target 80 yards away. He groaned, even as it left the bow. The arrow arced towards the target, the size and shape of a man's body, and missed by several feet. Shit. Oh dear, said Christ. I haven't seen anything like it since, well, I can't remember. Used to be adequate. Where on earth did you pick up a set of shanks like that from? Oh my goodness. Just tell me what I need to do to put them right. Oh, that's easy enough. You're plucking with bowstring when you should just be letting it go, like this. He twanged out the string of his own bow to show what Cale was doing wrong, and it showed him, with enormous pleasure, how it should be done. You're also opening your mouth when you shoot, and dropping the elbow of your string arm before you let loose. Cale started to protest, and Cale interrupted Kleist. You're letting your string hand creep forward at the same time. Alright, I get the point, just talk me through it. I've gotten some bad habits, that's all. Kleist drew his breath through his teeth, as melodramatically as possible. I'm not sure myself. If it's as simple as a few bad habits, I think you're probably a choker. He pointed to his head with a finger. I think you've lost it up here, mate. Now that I think about it, yours is the worst case of the yips I've ever seen. You've just made that up. You've got the yips alright, and the staggers, the twitches, no cure. All that mouth gaping and elbow dropping. Just an exterior mark of the state of your soul. The real problem's in your spirit. Kleist put an arrow in his bow, drew back the string, and let it loose in one elegant movement. It arced beautifully and landed with a satisfying thwack in the chest of the target. You see, perfect, an outward sign of inward grace. But now Cale was laughing. He turned back to the quiver of arrows laying on the bench beside him. But as he did so, he saw Bosco walking through the middle of the field and approached Redeemer Gil, who immediately gestured an acolyte forward. Cale heard a soft zoot behind him, and turned his head to see Kleist furtively aiming his bow at the distant Bosco and making the sound of an arrow on its way. Go on, I dare you. Kleist laughed and turned back to his pupils sitting and talking some distance away. One of them, Donovan, had as usual taken advantage of any pause to begin sermonizing on the evils of the antagonists. They don't believe in a purgatory where you can burn away your sins and then go to heaven. They believe in justification by faith. There was a gasp of disbelief from some acolytes who were listening. They claim that each one of us is saved or damned by the unalterable choice of the Redeemer, and there is nothing you can do about it, and then take the tunes from drinking songs and use them for their hymns. The hanged Redeemer that they believe in never existed, and so they will die in their sins because they have a horror of confession, and so will depart this life with all their transgressions printed on their souls and be damned. Shut your gob, Donovan, said Kleist, and get back to work. Once the acolyte had left with his message for Cale, Bosco waved Redeemer Gil to one side so they could not be heard. There are rumours that the antagonists are talking to the laconic mercenaries. Are they solid? They're solid by the standard of rumours. Then we should be worried. A thought struck Gil. They'll need 10,000 or more to break us. How will they pay? The antagonists have found silver mines at Lorium. Not a rumour. Then God help us. Even if you have no more than a few thousand troops, 3, maybe, capable of going against laconic hired men, their reputation isn't exaggerated. God helps those who help themselves. If we cannot deal with men who fight only for money and not the glory of God, then we deserve to fail, to test, and to be expected. He smiled. In spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Isn't that right, Redeemer? Well, my Lord Militant, if it is a test, it's one I don't know how to pass, and if I don't pardon the sin of pride, there's no Redeemer who does. Are you quite sure about the sin of pride, I mean? What are you saying? It's not necessary to be obscure with me. I deserve better at your hands. Of course. My apologies for my own presumption. He beats himself gently on the chest 3 times. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I have been expecting this, or something like it, for some time. I have always felt that our faith would be tested and tested harshly. The Redeemer was sent to save us, and mankind replied to that divine gift by hanging my love from a gibbet. His eyes began to mist over as he stared into the distance, as if it's something he had witnessed himself, though a millennium had passed since the Redeemer's execution. He sighed deeply again, and as if at terrible and recent grief, and then looked directly at Gil. I can't say more. and he touched his arm lightly, and with true affection. Except that if this report is true, then I haven't been idle in my search for an end to the apostasy, from the antagonists and to putting right the awful crime of doing murder to the only messenger of God. He smiled at Cale. There's a new tactic. I don't understand. Not a military tactic, a new way of seeing things. We should no longer think of just the problem of the antagonist, but of an ultimate solution to the problem of human evil itself. He urged Cale closer and lowered his voice still further. For too long we've been ready to think only about the antagonist heresy and our war with them, what they do, what they don't do. We have forgotten that there is secondary importance to the purpose to allow no God but the one true God, and no faith but the one true faith. We have allowed ourselves to become stuck in this war, as if it were an end in itself. We have let it become one squabble in a world filled with squabbles. Forgive me, Lord, but the Eastern Front covers 1,000 miles, and the dead can be numbered in hundreds and thousands. That's not a squabble. We are not the Matarazzi, or the Janes, interested in war for only gain or power. That's all we've become, one power amongst many in the war of all against all, because like them we desire victory but fear defeat. It's sensible to be leery of defeat. We are representatives of God on earth through his Redeemer. There is a single purpose to our existence, and we've forgotten it because we're afraid, so things must change. Better to fall once than be forever falling. Either we believe that we have God on our side, or we do not. If that's what we truly believe, then what we affect to believe, then it follows that we must pursue absolute victory, or none at all. If you say so, Lord. Bosco laughed, a sweet sound, genuinely amused. I do say so, friend. Both Cale and Kleist were aware of the acolyte as he walked up to them, pleased at the chance to deliver what he clearly felt was unpleasant news, and he started to speak. Kleist interrupted. What do you want, Sulk? I'm busy. This put Sulk off the slow malice with which he'd intended to spin out his news. Tough titty, Kleist, it's got nothing to do with you. Redeemer Bosco wants to see Cale in his rooms after night prayers. Fine, said Kleist, as if this was utterly routine. Now piss off. Taken off guard both by the hostile lack of curiosity and by the fact that Cale was staring at his old way, Sulk spat on the ground to show his own indifference and walked away. Cale and Kleist looked at each other, because Cale was Bosco's zealot. Calls for him to go and see the Lord Militant, something that would have terrified any other boy, were not uncommon. What was unusual, and therefore disturbing given the events of the day before, was that Cale had been called to his private rooms and not until late evening. This had never happened before. What if he knows? Said Kleist. Then we'd be in the house of special purpose already. It'd be just like Bosco to make us think that. I suppose, but there's nothing we can do about it now. Cale drew back the bow, held for a second, and then loosed the arrow. It arced towards the target, and missed by a good 12 inches. And quite honestly, I'm going to stop reading that, because, yeah, my throaty is hurting. I still have a few more pages left until the end. About 4 pages left until chapter 5, but that is about as much as I can do today, because I can feel my voice dying in my throat as I talk. So, I'm very sorry about that. So yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me ramble on in books. I read 2 books today. I read up to chapter 20 in the Book of Lost Things, and 4 pages before chapter 5 in The Left Hand of God. I probably won't be doing this again. I'll probably just stop reading next time, because that was quite a lot of reading. We're almost to 4 hours. But yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of your days or nights. I hope you enjoy sleeping if you have slept, or if you can sleep. And I will probably see you again tomorrow in around the same time, about 11 o'clock my time, or 3 hours and 40 minutes ago, in whatever time you're in. My schedule is usually pretty accurate as to what I'm going to be doing that day. I wish you all the most wonderful of days, or of nights, and I will see you again soon. Goodbye.